Bernie Sanders has been traveling across the country campaigning for Democrats, and he is attending 2 and even in some cases 3 rallies per day. So you can tell he's tired, right? And he's just done with the bullshit. And I'm going to show you a clip that kind of demonstrates that, but I'm showing it to you not just because it's entertaining, but I think there's a lot of strategic value in this clip. So in the state of Nevada, he was campaigning and he was met with a bunch of hecklers, specifically Donald Trump supporters who held up big Make America Great Again banners. And his response, in my opinion, was perfect, specifically when you think about his framing. Take a look.
We have now is a situation in Washington in where you have Trump and his Republican friends prepared to give a... Really? Do you really want to give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the 1%? Do you really want to throw 32 million Americans off the health care that they have? Brothers and sisters, our agenda is a little bit different. Unlike Republicans who haven't raised the minimum wage in this state for 10 years, we're going to fight to raise that minimum wage to a living wage, $15 an hour. And when we talk about wage fairness, we're going to do away with the absurdity of women making 80 cents on the dollar. And when we talk about women's rights, we know that it's not the government who's going to control a woman's body. It is the women themselves. And while we're here on this great campus, we say loudly and proudly that we are going to make public colleges and universities tuition-free. And we are going to substantially lower student debt, which is such a burden for so many people. And when people tell us we can't afford to do that, well, we say that if Trump can give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the 1%, you're damn well sure we can make public colleges.
Now, ask yourself this. Why was Bernie Sanders' response to them so effective? I mean, because he was already emboldened, no matter what he said, since the crowd was already on his side, and that was just a couple of hecklers. But why was his response so brilliant? Well, you have to look at the framing. It all comes down to framing. The way that he framed his questions to them made it seem as if you disagree with Bernie Sanders' policy positions, then you're not just wrong, you're actually being unreasonable. Because think of these quotes. Really? Do you really want to give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the 1%? Is that what you want? Do you really want to throw 32 million Americans off the healthcare that they have? I mean, you're framing this in a way that if they reveal their true policy position, well, sure, if you support Donald Trump, that is, in effect, what you support. But of course, no reasonable person would admit to that, so Bernie Sanders took the worst of what Trump has to offer and flipped it around on them and said, look, do you really support these horrendous things that Donald Trump is doing? And I think that that's a really clever way to frame questions to our political opponents. And as you saw, he then moved on to various policy proposals that he supports. And that's important because if you are going to frame your opponent's policies, then you've also got to counter with your own policy proposals. And when you see that juxtaposition between Bernie's proposals and Trump's proposals, it's a really, I think, effective way to get your message across. and really show this contrast between individuals like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, even if the establishment wants to tie Bernie to Trump because they're both anti-establishment, or certainly espouse anti-establishment rhetoric, because at this point, I don't think Donald Trump is anti-establishment because he's doing the establishment's bidding. But Bernie Sanders, he is anti-establishment. Now, the reason why I think this is important is because in conversations with our peers in 2020, it's coming up, we're going to need to adopt this type of framing if we want to win, not just against Republicans, but corporate Democrats. Because think about this. Who's going to be Bernie Sanders' biggest competition in 2020? It's going to be entrenched establishment politicians like Joe Biden. But if you frame questions about policy in this way to fellow liberals who may be further towards the center than you, then it is, I think, a powerful way to make a point about the policies that we support. So when it comes to Medicare for all, you can say, really? So you think it's acceptable that people who can't afford health insurance die and go bankrupt in this country? Really? And it makes it seem as if that policy is common sense, because it is. And I think that this debate probably won't be as intense in 2020 as it was in 2016, because we've won this debate, right? 70% of the country, including a slim majority of Republicans, support Medicare for all. But that's just an example of how we should frame questions. Look at the worst aspect of your opponent's policy and frame it in a way so that way they have to answer for that, right? The point is that our positions are populist, and I think they're common sense positions to have, so we need to start framing them in a way that makes other people seem like they're the ones who are being unreasonable if they disagree with us, and understand that as we fight to monopolize the discussion when it comes to certain political issues, progressives are forced to play defense. We're forced to convince everyone else that we're the ones who are reasonable. We're not being unreasonable. I mean, just think of the healthcare debate. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was on CNN with Jake Tapper, the way that he framed the question about how do you pay for this, he made it seem as if she's unreasonable. The whole premise put her on the defensive by default. And that's not fair, because she has the argument that's actually reasonable, and Jake Tapper is someone who's being unreasonable by being against Medicare for all. So progressives shouldn't be in this position wherein they're forced to prove that they're reasonable when everyone else is being unreasonable. And in framing issues this way, the way that Bernie Sanders framed it, I think that we are kind of putting our opponents on the defensive. We're forcing them to defend whether or not they're reasonable or unreasonable, and that matters. Framing matters. So I wanted to share this clip because it really got the gears in my head spinning about different strategies that we can use going into 2020, the way that we frame questions and debates with our opponents. All of this matters. Framing is incredibly important. However, I will say this. A lot has changed since 2016. So it may be the case that corporate Democrats are paying attention, and they could actually use this strategy against Bernie Sanders in an attempt to outflank him from the left. We've talked about this before, but Bernie Sanders won't unequivocally say that he supports abolishing ICE. Well, there are other Democratic senators who are likely going to be running, like Kirsten Gillibrand, who said she supports abolishing ICE. And also, I want to get to a quote from Bernie in this same clip with regard to something he said about student loan debt. He said that his goal is to substantially lower student loan debt. Now, as someone with thousands upon thousands of dollars of student loan debt, that sounds amazing. But do you want to know what sounds even better than substantially lowering student loan debt? Canceling it all together, because this issue affects an estimated 44 million Americans, and studies are beginning to show that if we actually cancel that 1.4 trillion in student loan debt, we actually can grow the economy. And modern monetary theorists like Stephanie Kelton seem to be leaning towards cancellation as the solution to this issue as well. So all it would take is just one other candidate to use this framing against Bernie Sanders and say, so you're against student loan debt cancellation? So you were able to make it through college with little to no debt, but people nowadays, they still have to have debt? Really? You think that that's reasonable? So understand how we're kind of in this different political climate to where going into 2020, everyone, with the exception of Joe Biden, knows that if you want to win a Democratic Party primary, you've got to be liberal, you've got to be progressive. And framing really matters, but it's why you have to be unapologetically progressive on every single issue. So I am worried that, Bernie Sanders is kind of setting himself up to be outflanked from the left. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that we have to be mindful of. And at the end of the day, if we adopt Bernie Sanders' framing with regard to the issues and use that as a guide, I think it can help us in persuading individuals on our side to vote for Bernie and not someone like Joe Biden, who's a corporate Democrat who is trying to position himself as an anti-populist or the anti-Bernie at a time when we desperately need people to be populist and actually listen to the American people. So, I just wanted to share the clip with you because I thought it was entertaining and there was also some strategic value that we could extrapolate from that. But understand, in looking at this framing, Bernie's got to be cognizant of the fact that you can only use this framing if you're the most liberal, populist, progressive candidate in the field. But if he's going to set himself up, or he is setting himself up to potentially be outflanked on a number of issues, which is really problematic. So, look, the framing is great, but we've got to get the right policies to go with that framing, because otherwise, the framing doesn't matter if you're not correct on the issues. But, overall, I still am going to be an enthusiastic Bernie Sanders supporter, because no matter what any other corporate Democrat says, if you take corporate money, I can't believe that you're going to be fighting for us. And that's one thing that Bernie Sanders has going for him. So we've got to be cognizant of the framing and the way we speak to peers about this, because there's too much at stake to lose. And I think we can learn a lot from watching the way Bernie Sanders communicates with political opponents. And, I'll leave it there.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.